All right. Welcome to the last of this series of 8 scripts, endangered alphabets in 8 scripts. And in many ways, this is the most hopeful of all of them. It's also kind of a warning about the perils of progress in the whole field of endangered languages and endangered scripts. What we're going to do is to look at the script or the group of scripts that in some respects is showing the strongest signs of support for revitalization, but then the challenges that are involved in all of that. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I also need to add that my printer, my computer and my printer developed this autoimmune disease where my computer now thinks that my printer is a virus. And so I couldn't print out certain things that I wanted to have in front of me. So every so often I'm going to have recourse to extremely tiny notes that I sent to myself on my phone. Okay, so here we go. So this is the Baybayin script, which was being used in the islands we now call the Philippines, even before the Spanish arrived. They were sort of astonished to discover that there was any literacy at all, let alone a reasonable rate of literacy. And some of the occupying authorities and the priests took an interest in it. There were materials that were copied. There was a certain amount of preservation went on. But of course, as in any colonial situation, what it meant was that anybody who really wanted to progress among the indigenous community had to learn Spanish, had to learn the Latin alphabet. And bit by bit, that became the prestige script and the prestige language. And so therefore, bit by bit, the indigenous script, and I'm using the plural here for a reason you'll see in a little while, they started to seem like the old way or the old people's writing. And also, as you'll see, this is inscribed in a bamboo tube. And in many respects, what the Spanish brought with them in terms of materials was also going to supplant the traditional writing materials. So one of the really interesting things about the Baybayin script is that it's pretty clear it probably came up from the south, from the islands that are now called Indonesia. And what you see on the lower line there is the Bugis language written in the Lontara script, which was written on palm leaves, on lontar palm leaves, in fact. And what you see in this script is this really characteristic boomerang shape, which is repeated in various configurations in all kinds of letters. It's doubled, it's inverted, and it's a particular movement of the hand and a particular glyph that works well for palm leaf writing with a stylus. The script arrived farther north in the islands we call the Philippines. Instead of being written on palm leaves, it was inscribed in bamboo. And what you'll see is that the letters did not change all that much. What changed was the necessary function of the material. So if you look at the first one in particular, a dot is perfectly possible when you're using an ink-like medium on a leaf. a dot inscribed with the point of a knife or other sharp implement in a bamboo is just going to disappear. You're not going to be able to see it. And so the boomerang shape has become this curve, this arched curve. And instead of the dot, we have this, this line that's obviously developed with someone putting the knife in and then just taking it down and wiggling as they went. There what you see is how sensitive writing is to local conditions, local materials, local vegetation, local climate even. So it's sort of a fascinating illustration of how the act of writing and the look of writing say a great deal more than you might think about the culture, the history of ideas, the history of technology. And when this very, very thin line had been cut or etched into the bamboo, then the habit was that the writer would scoop up a handful of ash and rub it on the writing so it would stand out more clearly, which I think is pretty clever, actually. So here is one of my carvings. So you see an extensive text in the Baybayin script. So the language that's being represented is Tagalog. And you'll notice several interesting things. The dots have now been replaced by the wiggles, also by little crosses as subscript. You'll also see that there are relatively recent additions in terms of punctuation. So the double vertical line marks the end of a sentence, but there aren't, in traditional Baybayin writing, there were not clear spaces between words or between sentences. It was a continuous text, which is actually quite common in Southeast Asia. And it raises really interesting questions about how does one think of a word? How does one think of a sentence? And Olash and I were talking about this the other day. What is a word? Especially if when you see it in the written form, you don't have that spacing. So this is in fact Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's from the first exhibition of carvings that I did. And when I was working on this, which was 2009, the consensus was that the Baybayin script was historic. And this is an attitude that you find in a number of countries. If a script is not official, the official attitude towards it is that it's no longer current, it's historic. It's sort of only for interest in terms of interpreting documents that are from the past. But interestingly enough, it was not quite historic. So in, I think, 2010, the government of the Philippines decided that they would actually introduce Baybayin script into the writing on the peso notes. If you look over toward the left of all three of these notes, directly underneath the denomination number, you can actually see a little Baybayin text. And in fact, the official explanation was that this was to make counterfeiting more difficult. But it meant something really interesting, which was that the Baybayin script was now literally backed by the currency. And around the same time, a Canadian guy growing up in Winnipeg, in a Filipino Tagalog-speaking community, also began researching the Baybayin script, its history, and creating a font for it. So even though that wasn't um, sort of to any degree widespread, it was sort of a start. And the other thing that was going on, and again, this is really interesting for the kind of visual iconography of writing, is that, as is also the case in, for example, Java and Bali and a number of other countries, the traditional script was still being used by tattoo artists. And one of them was a guy called Christian Cabouet, who had started out using the Baybayin as a tattoo medium, a tattoo form of expression. Tattoos are very interesting. We've talked about that on this series before, the idea that you are literally taking a visible manifestation of your culture and writing it on your skin as a gesture of belonging. And these can be tribal in a broad sense or tribal in a really narrow sense in terms of like gang tattoos. They can be narrative in the sense that I believe Maori tattoos say a great deal about the experience and the status, of the person tattooed. But what Christian Cabouet did was to start moving out of or beyond the tattoo genre and into art. And he began creating at first a kind of graffiti version. And I've talked to him once or twice, and my impression is that this is a cross between a sort of an anti-colonial defiance and also a desire to keep this traditional emblem of one's own ancestral identity alive in a creative way. So in other words, it's not just alive in terms of this is a historical document that we're keeping and we're studying. This is something I'm going to keep experimenting with and playing with and doing different things. And that's an active form of life. So this, which you can actually see also behind me here, is a carving that I did based on a text that he sent me. So this was an exhibition I did about 5 years ago for International Mother Language Day, and it says mother tongue in Tagalog. And what I tried to do with this was to actually capture this sort of hip hop style that he had been developing, which is almost sort of spray can, almost three-dimensional. And since then, he's been doing remarkable things. He's based in California, and he does live performances, and he has his own line of clothing with this sort of hip hop Baybayin style on it. And what he's doing is refusing to lie down, refusing to say, yeah, this is purely where we were. And in that sense, it really matches the Abenaki saying, which I've quoted several times on this series, which is, we are still here. We didn't die. We didn't go away. We may not be very numerous, but we are still here. So it's a statement of resilience and resolve in that sense. And what we have here is the first signs of things going beyond that. So this is an organization called Baybayin Buhayin, which has now been working for several years to bring respect to and to document and to research the Baybayin script and to bring it into the public attention. And this is in fact a conference. This is their Summit 2.0. This is their second conference that they had on the script. And I was honored to be invited to speak to a Zoom meeting Buhayin group. And I think there was something like 60 people on this Zoom conference. So it's a very committed group. And all power to them. I think that all over the world, there are groups like this. They're not necessarily as coherent or as organized. They're not necessarily as numerous, but they're very much driven by the same desire. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind about the Philippines is that having spent nearly 400 years, certainly 350 years, with the colonial language being Spanish, after the Spanish-American War, all of a sudden the colonial language is now English. And so I get the impression, and I could be wrong, that they are particularly aware of themselves as a colonized people because the regime shifted. And so therefore, they may be particularly aware that their traditions and their roots are neither Spanish, nor are they American, nor are they even really Filipino, because there are people I've spoken to who actually object to the islands being named after one of the kings of Spain. It's like, wait a sec, we have our own names for ourselves and where we live. What we're seeing here then is the growth, especially over the last 10 years, of a revitalization and protection movement. And we're going to come back to that in just a minute, because one of the complexities here, and one of the challenges, is that the Baybayin script is not the only traditional indigenous script of the islands we now call the Philippines. It is the script that was used to write Tagalog, and Tagalog language and Tagalog culture have been identified as sort of the dominant indigenous culture and language of the Philippines. But that doesn't mean they're the only one. And as we've seen in many other instances around the world, when you identify a minority, then that doesn't mean they're the only minority. So I grew up in England, and in the early 1970s, you were starting to see Welsh on signs. And the official line on Cornish from Cornwall was that it was extinct, and also that Manx from the Isle of Man was extinct, etc. Now there are very active movements in these regional languages of the British Isles, but it must have seemed, 40 years ago, as if they weren't there. They just didn't exist. So what we're going to do now is Tagbanwa, which is from Palawan, from the island of Palawan. It's really a very close relative of Baybayin, but it isn't the same. And straight away, this raises the question, you have two similar scripts. Do you treat them as two different scripts in your acts of revitalization? Or do you essentially say, that's close enough, and you merge one with the other, which is actually rather like behaving in a colonial fashion. What you're saying is the smaller number does not matter. It needs to be sacrificed for the convenience of the larger number. So that one is Tagbanwa. So this is Kulatan, which is used to write the Kapampangan language from Luzon. It is, I suppose, distantly similar to Baybayin, but it certainly isn't the same script. And there are very active Kulatan activists and writers who are extremely aware that in the movement to promote the Baybayin script, they are being left out. And in fact, I believe, and this is anecdotal, that one of the moves that was seen to be a positive move is that some signage has gone up in addition to the Latin script, also in the Baybayin script. But some of that signage is in areas where if you are population density, you should really be seeing Kulatan script. So the situation is on the one hand promising, on the other hand challenging. So here on Mindoro, you actually have two scripts on Mindoro. This is the Surat Buhid or Buhid script. And as you can see, this one very squared in its execution, really quite different. Traditionally used in spells and charms, but also in poetry. There's a strong poetry tradition. And also nearby, there is the Surat Manyan, also known as Hanunuo. And here is somebody actually writing on bamboo with the sort of sharpened stylus. And you can't see it very clearly, but it's clearly somewhat different from Surat Buhid. So again, you have this this question. These are scripts that are traditional. They are used only by an almost vanishingly small number of people, but they are absolutely emblems of the cultural heritage of those particular communities on those particular islands. And when you have a nation that is made up of islands, and those islands have traditionally had their own individual cultures, you're going to find this a lot. You also find it, for example, in Indonesia. So typically, the instinct is to say, well, our preservation efforts are going to be directed to, for example, what is easiest to preserve, or what they're the most documents in, or what they're the most users for or of, or what they're the most information about. But what that means then is that the very people who've been marginalized most over the last 4 or 5 centuries continue to be marginalized. This is a really interesting aspect of post-colonial theory. And you find this all over the world, where when a colonial authority is removed, the replacing authority often behaves actually in a colonial fashion. The Philippines are not doing that in the same way as various other nations and cultures, which is why they're featured today. But you can see some of the problems that exist. And so my hat is off to the Manyan Heritage Center on Mindoro, which is not particularly well funded and not particularly well staffed in terms of scope and size, but absolutely dedicated to researching and preserving, documenting, writing, and teaching in some of these most marginalized traditional scripts. And then there is Eskayan, which is in some respects, the most interesting one of all. Its history is shrouded in mystery, no pun, no rhyme intended. It seems to have been a messianic script created by a charismatic leader. We've heard this before in Southeast Asia and southern China. It's loosely based on the Latin alphabet, but has all kinds of elaborations. There are all kinds of letters that actually are not used. It has a huge symbol count. I think it's like 900. I should have looked this up before giving this talk, but did I? No. But in fact, several hundred of these symbols are never used. So it's a mystery. And the expert on this script, whom I've quoted before in this series, is the wonderful and redoubtable Piers Kelly, whom I have described as the Indiana Jones of typography and paleography, because he actually goes out in the field and studies this stuff. But the Askayan people who live on the island of Bohol, very, very few of them still use the Askayan script, and yet it is theirs. And so you have a writing system that can't be said even to be traditional in the sense that the others I've mentioned are traditional, in other words, documented for several hundred years, and yet it's part of the identity of the Askayan people. So this is where I need to grab my phone and make sure I have this document here. Okay, good. So this is absolutely groundbreaking stuff. So in April 2018, the House of Representatives in the Congress of the Philippines proposed an act promoting Philippine indigenous or traditional writing systems and providing for their protection, preservation, and conservation. So I don't know of any other country in the world, with the exception of Morocco, where the government has paid such attention to its indigenous writing systems. And I have to say, the first draft of this bill, I believe, specifically was about Baybayin. But there was sufficient pressure or turmoil or opinion, should we say, about the fact that that then discriminated against the other writing systems, that it was rewritten now to include indigenous or traditional writing systems, plural. And they've given significant thought to what this actually involves. And so this is where I'm going to start reading just a few things off my phone. So the act is quite long and laudably detailed. So the act includes that the Department of Education and the Commission on Higher Education should include writing systems in the relevant subjects of the basic and higher education curricula, and create an elective or specialized course in higher education for the same. This is always the question. When you teach, do you use the indigenous script as an elective or as the means of instruction? As soon as it becomes the medium of instruction, then it gets used that much more. It becomes that much more solid, that much more quickly, but it relies on teachers actually knowing how to use it. So, and there's a challenge right there. Second one, creating and supporting activities that promote the awareness of writing systems during festivals, occasions, and events, conducting seminars, conferences, conventions, symposia, and other relevant activities on the study of the writing systems, taking consideration of the writing system that is indigenous to a particular region. That is huge because it involves money, involves time, involves personnel, and involves training. That's, again, a huge commitment. So by comparison, for example, Canada is very aware of First Nations. They've actually created a university called First Nations University, and yet First Nation languages and scripts do not have the kind of protection that the Philippines are proposing. Ensuring the proper record keeping of relevant documents and preservation of oral evidence on the writing systems. So you're talking about oral histories being captured, etc. And then there are things like signage, but then how about this? All manufacturers of locally produced processed food products to inscribe local scripts and their translation on the containers and labels. So it's only when you get that down to that level of detail that you realize that the kind of thing that we see in the United States, where, you know, if you go into a pharmacy, there is sort of important information about your flu shot in maybe 6 different languages. But if you actually look at any of the medications that you might need, then you're out of luck. you've got to speak the dominant language and use the dominant alphabet. Otherwise, you don't know what's going on. So I've said this before. If you are a refugee, if you're an indigenous person, a member of minority, then all of the most important acts in your life when you connect with other people, namely the law, education, healthcare, banking, all of those are done in a foreign language. All of those are done in a foreign script. And so at those crucial aspects of their life, you are at a disadvantage. So that is pretty much all I have for today. And I'm aware that I am not providing any clear answers as to how to proceed, because the fact that this bill has not yet been passed into law may be an indication of all of the challenges that are involved in actually implementing all of the things that it proposes. And if you think about other countries that have more languages, okay, so Australia has more endangered languages than any other country. If you imagine a bill proposed in Australia to protect, preserve, conserve, teach all of the traditional Australian languages, which are almost exclusively, I believe, oral languages that don't have any of their own writing systems as far as I know. But imagine what that would actually involve, making that kind of commitment. It's actually a similar kind of commitment to the idea of restitution in the United States, where you say this economy was founded on African-American slave labor. Let's actually pay them back. And you realize that the challenges involved in just proceeding, even if you have the best will in the world, are enormous. As you all know, I am utterly in favor of respecting and protecting and promoting traditional cultures and their languages and their writing systems. Today's talk is really about how moving forward is undoubtedly the thing to do. That doesn't mean it necessarily is easy or it gets any easier. And it also doesn't mean that the conversation is at all streamlined. The conversation is likely to fragment more and more as you get different voices joining that conversation and saying, what about Tagbanwa? What about Surat Manyan, etc.? And the conversation only becomes more difficult, and therefore it can only be conducted with a non-colonial attitude of equality and equal respect. And to me, that's where it is. So I am going to stop screen sharing. I'm going to reappear in front of you. And I will happily take questions.
I have a question, or just a request for you to maybe elaborate a little bit on something. You were talking about the situation with Cornish and
Manx.
particularly Manx. I've been studying Scottish Gaelic for about 3 years, and an interesting situation came up the other day in one of my classes. We were talking to a man who is pretty much native fluency, and he said that a situation is developing. As you probably know, Gaelic medium education is pretty well established, with children being instructed in Gaelic when their parents prefer for that. But he said a situation is developing, and I would not have even imagined this happening. He said where the language used in Gaelic medium education has been elaborated to the point where many older native speakers feel uncomfortable using it because they are not up to speed with the newer terms that have been brought into use with the children. So he said often older Gaelic speakers will not speak the language with people that they don't know because they feel so uncomfortable not knowing all the terminology that's normal to their children. And I wonder, have you seen anything parallel to this or like it and how people have handled it?
Yes. Um, so that is a situation that really has multiple dimensions to it. So on the one hand, it's actually the kind of situation you see with computers. So elderly people who didn't grow up with computers and still rarely use computers, intimidated or angered or bewildered by them. And the fact that their children or grandchildren are so fluent and so conversant is something that, we're now seeing that absolutely anywhere. So to a certain extent, that's a feature of the kind of the generational nature of change anyway. In terms of language, yes, you have this kind of interesting situation where if you say we want to preserve Scots Gaelic or we want to preserve Cornish, then you have to sort of say which Scots Gaelic and which Cornish. So the last speaker, the last mother tongue speaker of Cornish died in the 18th century. So Cornish has been sort of reconstructed, and there are now, I don't know how many, but there's certainly a sort of a strong body of Cornish proponents.
There's definitely enough that it shows up regularly in my Twitter timeline.
Yes, exactly. And there you start finding a situation which you find, and you have found in Cherokee for the last roughly 15 years, certainly 10 years, which is that the Cherokee faced this dilemma because Cherokee, as it was spoken at the beginning of the Cherokee revival in the late 70s and into the 80s, was essentially a 19th century agrarian language, because the Cherokee had been so marginalized that their language was not used for all of the things that were changing in the intervening 150 years, right? So what the Cherokee decided they would do was that if they didn't, and this goes back to your Scots Gaelic question, if they didn't have a language which met present day needs, then the revival would be doomed because their children wouldn't speak it. It had to be current for it to be useful, especially for children. And so what they started doing was they set up these amazing sort of language committee meetings. So in France, this would be like the Académie Française would like sit around and all of these academics would decide, how to update the language. But among the Cherokee, these are ordinary people meeting on a monthly basis and, probably bringing in a cold dish to eat while they're meeting and gathering. And they, I think I may have said this during the Cherokee talk, they actually decide, so what word are we going to use for computer, for example? And there was, I talked to one of their language teachers who had this very funny thing. He said, the word computer actually means a person who counts. So that doesn't make sense whatsoever. So we're not going to use that word. And so they said, well, let's come up with other words that are Cherokee words that whose roots better describe what a computer actually does. And so they came up with these compound words that mean box that makes you lazy. At last I heard, which was, I had this conversation several years ago, they hadn't come up at the time with a consensus on what word they were going to actually use. But there you saw this great process where it was, where the language was being updated. But the difference between this and what you're talking about is that the people who were doing the updating were the community elders and community members. So instead of it happening in, for example, a school with youngish teachers and young students, and the elders then feeling left behind, the whole thing was happening on a community-wide basis. So that kind of split, although doubtless it still happens to some extent, you know, you get an elderly person saying, I can't remember what the word is nowadays for, and they'll have the English word, but they won't necessarily yet have the Cherokee word. But nevertheless, I think, as with so many of these things, it all comes from creating it out of the community as a whole.
I wonder if this could also be a geographic issue now that I stopped to think about it, because so many of the older fluent speakers in Scotland are in the outer islands and such.
Yep.
So that, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't take much for some of those back roads in Scotland to become hard to drive.
The ones that have
the same would be
to
true.
them.
The same would also be true in, say, you know, Oklahoma or, you know, or the eastern Cherokee lands, I suppose. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if the combination of an aging population and the fact that on the Scottish Islands, I believe you still have a practice of the younger people migrating to the mainland, as you have done for like 100 years now. You'll get this dwindling population. That's a real threat. It really is a real threat. Okay, other question.
There's a couple in chat. I was also remembering that in the 70s and 80s, the term idiot box gained some traction for.
Yes, yes. The photo with green bamboo. So this was the Surat Manyan or Hanunoro script, showed very pointy shapes with straight lines and acute angles. Why do we believe the wavy nature of Baybayin is due to the material? Two things. One is I don't know as much as I should do. The other is that even on the island of Mindoro, there are variations that have turned up in terms of what part of the knife is used to do the notching or the etching. So there is, in one area, the actual point of the knife is used, and in another area, the sort of side point of the knife is used. And so you can actually see the difference. I don't suppose anybody knows why that stylistic variation diverged, but you can actually see the difference between the two scripts just from the part of the knife that's being used. Equally, in the Thai scripts in Myanmar or Burma, there are individual variations that probably developed because one scribe did it a certain way, and because the scribal tradition tended to be passed down often within families, then you have something which is an eccentricity or an idiosyncrasy becoming gospel. So that's the best I can do on that question. Presumably, and this is from Jan, presumably languages and scripts kept appearing and disappearing throughout the history. Doesn't actively trying to preserve the current state slow down not only the disappearing, but also the appearing of new ones? That's a wonderful question. I'm glad to say no, because more new scripts are being created now than at any time in history. So if you're a science fiction fan, for example, then you will have seen countless scripts that have been created in the last, say, 40 years. I'm thinking since the original Star Trek. and certainly in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So I have a friend and follower who commissioned me to do a carving for her in Gallifreyan, which, as you'll know, is the script of the Time Lords in Doctor Who. So there is no shortage of scripts. In addition to which, and on a more serious note, as I say, I've said this in another talk, I know of at least 100 scripts that have been created in the last 100 years, some of them in the last 10 years. The actual tradition that's happening worldwide is a steady growth in the respect for traditional cultures and their cultural artifacts, such as languages and scripts. So the good news, Jan, is no, we're fine. Remember Tolkien? Yes, we the diehards tend not to forget him. Exactly. I've also been commissioned to do two carvings in Elvish. So yes, alive.
Just to add something,
Yeah, go for it.
It's kind of interesting that we are living in a time when I more important and realized by people. And I think it also influences the way that the conlangs work, because people connect identity with their own language in their own conlang. And it seems to be a rite of passage for every proper linguist to invent at least one of them.
Right. And interestingly enough, if you flip that one over on its back, let's go back to Richard Attenborough's film Gandhi, right? So Gandhi was made, I believe, in the 70s, late 70s maybe. And at that point, he still thought it was fine to have a British actor playing arguably the greatest Indian person who ever lived. It seems to me that one of the things that's happening is that we are very slowly drifting away from that kind of colonial ownership of other cultures. And one of the ways that that shows up is that if you're writing a science fiction novel, you don't assume that every race speaks English. Because if you go back, even someone like Isaac Asimov, who was a great science fiction writer and a visionary, I don't believe he did a whole lot of kind of sort of cultural and linguistic reification. Those of you who are more science fiction-y fanny than I should speak up at this point. But certainly I went through a phase of reading a lot of science fiction when I was much younger. And if there were any languages other than English, it was just a phrase or two here and there. I would like to think that people are steadily getting more interested in other people.
There's a wonderful older book called Aliens and Linguists. I can't remember who wrote it, but it's a beautiful little piece of work. And I think it was it Suzette Haydn Elgin who said that science fiction writers will put their characters through any sort of torment that they can dream up, except that of learning another language. She said that they will put them through anything that they can come up with, except that. And I think the awareness of that has shifted dramatically. There is a very interesting series, and I'm sorry that I cannot remember the woman's name right now, about a woman, an anthropologist who becomes part of a spaceship crew to study this other culture and is slowly separated from everything that she brought with her. She's the only human in this crew, but is slowly separated from everything that she brought with her materially that marked her as human. And at first she's very excited about this, but then she begins to realize what it really means to lose touch with everything that she brought with her. But yeah, I think the awareness of this is definitely growing.
Got it.
The really good book on this was Ursula Le Guin as well.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking the same
And
thing.
I really like her. And when I realized that she's actually Ursula Kreber Le Guin, that anthropologist Kreber's daughter, it's amazing.
Yes, yes.
And her books
Very
are
much.
very interesting, and the ideas that she got in them is just.
And I think Douglas Adams made fun of that, anything but learn another language tradition by inventing the Babel fish, the whole idea that all you have to do is shove a fish in your ear and you can understand anything, because
Well, Star Trek's equally guilty with the universal translator device.
But
exactly,
Star Trek invented mobile phones. Remember that?
that's true. Yep. I mean, it must have been so annoying to have your phone like tweet every time you opened it up like that. Okay, I'll take one more question. All right, in that case, I would like to take this last opportunity to draw your attention, and many of you have already had your attention drawn to our Kickstarter campaign, which is going great guns, but could always use more guns, as they say in the colonial business. The link to the Kickstarter, you can find it because Alec has posted it across the top of our two homepage sites, endangeredalphabets.com and endangeredalphabets.net. As you know, we are creating a game and a series of other activities as well. Forestall the effects of Chinese, I'm not sure if you would call it colonial, but certainly cultural genocide in Mongolia, and to preserve, protect, and promote, as they say in the Philippines, the traditional Mongolian script and language. So thank you once again for making this journey with me. I now leave. Olish, you may have your nights to yourself on Sundays. You don't need to stay up until break of dawn to join us. And at some point, I'm sure I'll come up with another series, and I'm sure you will hear about it because you're on the list, whether you like it or not. All right, take care. Bye-bye, everybody.